2022. Welcome to episode 6 of the Dispatch. We are excited to be with you guys tonight. And we've just got a couple things to cover. I don't want to probably get into too long of a show tonight, but we definitely had a couple of topics that we wanted to cover and make sure that you guys were aware of, as well as a couple of the latest stories that we have done. So before I get into all of that, I want to make sure everybody knows that my health is much better. We're still working on the back. The foot is fine. If I stand on it for a long time, the surgical site still turns a little red. As far as the back goes, um, yeah, still the disc pushing on my nerve right now, like I did for the longest time. I'm not saying it's all better. My back feels like really weak, and that's probably from basically having not done a lot of exercise since June 2nd when I did the foot surgery. So um, hopeful and prayerful that the back kind of holds up as it is right now, at the very least, which is that I have two discs that are bulging and one does not appear to be pushing on my sciatic nerve right this moment or last day and a half. So hopefully that stays, because that is extremely painful. Um, the other thing is, before we get into the stories, our goal by the end of the year is 500 total monthly subscribers. And at the beginning of July, we said, well, we've got to hit about 25 a month to make that happen. We fell just a couple short. So I think we're at 372 monthly subscribers. We were trying to hit 375. By the end of August, we're trying to hit 400. So again, $297 a month. It helps support the Idaho Dispatch. You'll get the quarterly, which I'm working on the next batch right now. So if you want that, be sure to get in while you can. But help us to hit 400 monthly subscribers by the end of August, which means we need at least 28 new ones. We always lose some during the month. That's very common, as most of you know. And so we've got to probably hit higher than 28. But the goal is to be at 400 by the end of the month. So if $297 a month is worth it for us to continue this effort and well into the future, then the goal is to hit another 28 additional monthly subscribers by the end of August. You can go to idahodispatch.com/subscribe. It's down in the ticker there. And, if it's less than like half a cup of coffee, then we'd be honored to have you guys on board. So with that, let's jump right into the just a couple of the things that I wanted to do today. And I totally accidentally logged out of the survey. So we've been doing some online surveys, and again, these are not scientific. They're not, so you just take them with a grain of salt, like you would basically any poll, even if it is scientific. But we've been running a poll, and we've got 500 and looks like 575, I think, responses to this. Here, let me double check and see. 575 responses to a poll that we've done. And we've done a variety of these. The first 300, so about half, just over half, came from probably mostly Idaho Dispatch readers, right? People who know that our goal is unbiased news as best as possible. People who are on our email list that got the poll. Again, people who typically understand what we are trying to do. And that's where the first about 300 responses came from. And so the poll was, how do you prefer your political news? And, maybe I should have had an additional response on here, because a lot of people are like, I just want accurate news. Okay. I guess in my opinion, when I was going for with the option of as unbiased as possible, I was hoping that factual was also kind of included in there, but that's my fault. I probably should have worded that a little bit better. But it was about 72%, I think 74%, somewhere in there initially through that first 300 responses that said you wanted it as unbiased as possible. And then the other options were you only want your political news from a conservative viewpoint, or maybe slant, and then another option for slanted conservative. So maybe both sides were in there, but it was definitely a more conservative slant. And then there was only from a liberal viewpoint, and then slanted from a liberal viewpoint, and then you just didn't have a preference. Okay, and so those were the 5 or 6 options, whatever it is. And at the time, 72 to 74% said from as unbiased as possible. Okay. Now we are up to 500. So what I ended up doing was I think we spent about $200 and we boosted the survey out and left it a very broad. It was like Idaho's liberals and conservatives. We didn't really care, right? We wanted it from as broad of a spectrum as possible. And so, given all of that information, it went up to now 79% of you had answered that poll as unbiased as possible. 10.1% slanted towards a conservative viewpoint, 8.9% only from a conservative viewpoint, and then 1.7 said they did not have any preference. So I don't know what to make of that. Again, it's not a scientific poll. I'd be really curious to see some scientific poll done, but odds are I'm not going to spend $5,000 or $10,000 just on a similar poll through a scientific company. Is it that high? I don't know. I've had a lot of discussions with folks about the results of this poll, and a lot of them think that it's off because they think, no, conservatives in Idaho definitely want their news from a slanted viewpoint, right? Slanted towards conservatives. And I mention conservatives because Idaho, again, a heavily Republican state. And so you would think that more of the people that are going to answer in this poll are going to be from Republicans. And I said, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. Maybe this poll is way off and people would just rather have slanted conservative news. Even if, let's say it's accurate, right? Let's say it's accurate news regardless of what political spectrum it's coming from. Do you want your news, accurate, but slanted towards a conservative viewpoint, or only from a conservative viewpoint, or do you want it as unbiased as possible? And I said, I don't know. In talking to people, I think everyone likes the idea of accurate and unbiased news. They like that idea. And maybe they just don't see it, except for what we're trying to do, right? And so, what do you do? What do you do with that result? Do you say, okay, maybe this is what people really want, and they're just not getting it, or are people just answering the survey going, yeah, I really want conservative news, so I'm going to pick the unbiased thing because they want to feel like they would want their news unbiased. I really don't know. Again, this isn't a deep research poll or anything like that. It was just kind of like, hey, I'm kind of curious. What are the results of this poll? So I don't know if you guys took the poll. You can still take the poll. If you go to the website, it's going to pop up. We've been changing these polls out periodically just to give you guys something new to answer. But as of right now, almost 80% of the people who took this poll out of 575 people said that they preferred their political news, as unbiased as possible. And then again, there were some responses in the comments that said, I just want the truth, or I just want accurate news. I don't know. And I did word it as unbiased as possible for a reason, because I don't think anybody's perfect. I think everybody makes mistakes, and our effort is to do it as unbiased as possible. Again, not going to claim that we never do it, but it's never intentional, right? It's never intentional. So anyway, that was kind of an interesting result from that poll. I want to touch just briefly on two stories. One of them, and again, if you're just tuning in, thanks for tuning in. Please be sure to share the video, give it a thumbs up, and all that good stuff. We are trying to hit 400 monthly subscribers by the end of the month. We've got 28 to go, less than one a day. And so if you aren't a subscriber, we would encourage you to do so, because we've made it as cheap as possible. Hopefully that doesn't undermine what we're trying to do. There's more expensive options, so to speak, that you can do. The Biden administration, for those that didn't see, is suing the state of Idaho over the abortion law that was triggered by Roe v. Wade, being overturned. And so that trigger law is essentially the state legislature goes through and says, this is what Idaho's abortion law will look like if Roe v. Wade ever gets overturned. And that just happened to happen a lot quicker, obviously. And some people never thought that would happen. And so this trigger law is going into effect later this month. The Biden administration is suing to try and stop the state of Idaho from implementing this new abortion law, which takes effect on August 25th. So the Idaho Democrat Party and several Idaho legislators, Democrat legislators have come out in favor of this lawsuit. The governor, as well as the Idaho GOP party chair, Dorothy Moon, have come out opposed to the lawsuit. And we're just going to kind of keep you guys updated as best as possible throughout that lawsuit and throughout the process and kind of everything that's happening with that. So I don't know why I can't see. Oh, there we go. Now I can see it. So I wanted to read one comment before I jump in the next article. I don't think unbiased is possible in a platonic sense. Everyone will have some sort of bias, some perspective, some worldview. I want accurate news from someone I can trust, not to sneak in leftist propaganda like most of corporate media. So I guess we'll backtrack here for a second. So what is bias, right? I mean, there's going to be bias by omission, like leaving something out of a story. And, I mean, I don't think we've done that. You could argue that there are there may be bias in how much you're going to put in, right? If I'm writing an article, and a news article is supposed to be somewhere around 800 words, you're trying to cram everything in. You want to get all of the important points in, right, from each side. What each side says is the most important thing, and that's what we try to focus on. Is there going to be some nuances that are left out? Sure. Is that bias? I guess you could call it that. I don't. When I think of bias, it's like here's a story and there's three sides to this story, and you're deliberately leaving out one, or you give the other two sides 4 paragraphs worth of your article, and then this other side gets one sentence, right? Now there's just a deliberate and unabashed bias in that article. That's the type of stuff we try to avoid. We try to avoid any type of favoritism. And so you could do bias by omission if you're like deliberately not covering articles because you're trying to protect someone. And we've done our best not to do any of that. I've wrote articles that where a conservative and a liberal has been in negative limelight, so to speak, and tried to give each of them a fair opportunity to respond. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on how you look at bias and how you define it and all that kind of stuff. But, the stuff that's really bad that everybody hates, and the reason that the Idaho Dispatch was created for was to avoid all of that stuff where one side is deliberately maligned and attacked by the reporter, not by, a group or organization or something like that, but by the reporter, and they're being painted in a certain way by the reporter on purpose in order to target them. And so we do our best to avoid that kind of stuff. And then the final story, and this one, I've got to do some more research. I'll just say that out front. The Reclaim Idaho ballot initiative. So when Reclaim Idaho wrote their initiative, the tax code or the tax brackets were different, okay, than what they became in 2022. So when they wrote it long before the 2022 tax cuts went into effect, they were going off the old brackets. And so the way, if you've ever written legislation, the way that it typically works is you take the current code and then you decide what you want to do with it. So typically the way it works is, and just because I've written legislation before, we've gotten legislation passed before working with lawmakers on other stuff, is if you don't like certain parts of the code, then you strike it out, okay? And then if you want to add stuff to the code, I don't want to say if you don't like certain parts of the code, but if you're going to take out certain portions of the code, you strike it out. And if you want to add portions of the code, you write words and then you underline it and say, this is what I'm adding. Here's what we want to take out. And that's how you do it. And then you submit it to the Legislative Services Office, LSO, and they give you a draft form. They send that to the lawmaker, and the lawmaker gets that printed as a research slip. Now, with the ballot initiative, I don't know the exact way on how. I know it's submitted to the Secretary of State's office. I don't know if Reclaim Idaho had to go through the Legislative Services Office or whatever. But the bottom line is they wrote it based on how the old tax code was written, or tax brackets were written. And so what happened was that this year, the Idaho legislature passed a change in the code, in the Idaho code, that kind of, and this is where I think it gets a little murky, is that the portions they underlined, all that stuff kind of went out the door to some extent because of the new tax brackets. And so what Reclaim is saying is that, hey, the only portion that really matters is the portion that we underline. That's what we wanted to add. And so far, the state of Idaho and the SOS office, the SOS office and the AG's office have said, well, no, you wrote it based on the old tax thing, so we kind of have to add all of it back in. So even though the new tax brackets say this, we can't just take your underlined words and kind of add those in. We have to basically go back to what you put. You were adding your words to what the old tax bracket said, and that's what the state is saying. And to be honest with you, I don't really know. I mean, in theory, I'm not really sure how that works. Like in the state of, when you do a regular legislative session, if two bills are passed dealing with the same portions of code, I believe there's like a committee or something like that has to sit down, or maybe LSO just has to sit down and go, okay, we got to take these two things and figure out how to make them work together and then try to fix it. Now, you almost never see that happen. I'm not even aware of it ever happening. There was a potential issue of it happening years ago, and I asked about it, and that's what they told me was the process if there were two portions of code that were conflicting. But this is a little bit different because it was an initiative that was approved based on an old tax bracket, and now you have a new tax bracket. And so I don't think, from my knowledge, that you can kind of just merge them together and do what Reclaim Idaho co-founder Luke Mayville is saying, where we just want to do the added words, because in theory that's what he's right, in that he was only wanting to add those words to the tax code, but because it changed and the ballot initiative says here's what we're adding, and maybe that's what the state is looking at, right? And I don't know for sure, but maybe that's what the state is looking at, is that when the voters go to approve it on the ballot in November, the initiative says the old tax brackets, based on what it was in 2021. And so maybe that's why the state is saying, hey, look, the voters are going to go vote. It's not going to have the 2022 stuff. So they're going to read your underlined portion, but they're also going to be able to see what the tax brackets are. In theory, they may look at what the current tax brackets are and go, okay, based on what you're adding, I like what you're adding, or I don't like what you're adding based on how those tax brackets read on the ballot. And so that I think is kind of a unique situation. If it does pass, and it's called Prop 1, okay, for those that don't know, if it does pass, and it sounds like Mayville said if it does reverse the 2022 tax cuts, they may take it to court and try to sue. He believes that the AG and the SOS is wrong, and said in his Twitter that they've been wrong before. So anyway, it's kind of a unique situation. I've never seen anything like it. I just having written the code, I kind of understand both sides to some extent, but I think that, again, this is going to be my opinion on how this would work, is that you would have to use the old tax brackets, because that's how the signatures were collected, and that's what people will vote on based on when they open up their ballot. And I don't know how you could just say, well, we're going to go ahead and change that. Yeah, I just can't see that. And so, I mean, technically, this isn't the fault of Reclaim Idaho. Although some people have said that they tried to tell them, hey, you've got to go back and change this because of this new thing that passed, the new tax code that passed. But I don't know that they would have had time. They took quite a while to get the required signatures, and I don't remember when the tax law was signed in. It was fairly early. I think it was in January. At least very little time. We've got about 4 months that they would have had to try and redo all of the signatures all over again. So if the original proposal from Reclaim was a $323 million tax increase through a new tax bracket if you made $250,000 or more individually, or $500,000 as a couple. And they were also going to raise the corporate tax rate. And that top tax bracket would have been 10.234%, it looks like. Okay, if this is reversed, then it would add, if the other tax cuts were reversed, it'd be an additional 250 million in additional taxes, for a total of 573 million. So that's kind of where we're at on there. Somebody had something, I think. Brian Alman, I guess I don't know how to say your last name. Sorry. Alman says, leftists like Mayville want to raise taxes anyway, but he obviously wants to frame the narrative as raise taxes on the rich. Patrick Craig says, Reclaim Idaho used out-of-state signature collectors to get their Medicare debacle on the ballot. I would be willing to bet they did the same thing here. I never saw anybody asking for signatures. So anyway, we'll have to see how it plays out. We may not be able to see how this thing plays out until after it's voted on. If it does pass, what changes are made, and then potential lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. So, and if it doesn't pass, then it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't change anything, obviously. So anyway, all right, guys. Well, that's really all I had for today. Just a couple news stories. Again, my health is much better than it was. Be sure to subscribe to Idaho Dispatch. We'd love to have you guys on board. Share this video, give us a thumbs up, all that good stuff, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble if you haven't already. We appreciate you guys.